This man looked bizarre. He was wearing his mother's clothes and dancing alone in the house. But when he turned around, a human skin mask was on his face. The man's name was Ed Gein. Since childhood, he had a peculiar hobby, wearing his mother's clothes and silk stockings. He would then hang himself from the floor. The suffocating sensation would excite his brain at high speed. But suddenly, his mother burst into the room. Seeing him in this state, she immediately demanded that he take off everything he was wearing. She also claimed he had brought sin into the house. Augusta, a devout Christian, considered such behavior blasphemous. She asked why he was wearing her clothes. He replied that he was just joking around. However, she interpreted this as disrespect, which was completely unacceptable. She even forbade him from associating with girls. Ed Gein hastily declared that he had no interest in them, but his mother insisted she understood him perfectly. She even pointed out that the girl he was interested in was Pandora, a girl from the town. He continued to assert that person he liked wasn't Pandora, as she thought. The person he liked was Adeline. A heated argument ensued. His mother absolutely forbade him from touching women, from getting married, and from having children with anyone, because she considered it a sin. Ed Gein appeared resigned, but in reality his personality was gradually becoming distorted. After World War II ended, the torture methods used on prisoners in Nazi concentration camps were exposed. Many comic books even fictionalized Nazi officers to depict the brutality of fascism. But when Ed Gein saw scenes of torture in the comics, his eyes lit up. Back home, he could only suppress his desires by chopping wood. Just then, Ed Gein's brother, Henry, who had been out of contact, suddenly reappeared and said he was in love with a woman named Ginny. He wanted to marry her. However, Ed Gein stopped Henry, believing their mother wouldn't approve. Moreover, Ginny had been divorced twice. Henry understood that their mother wasn't normal. She had built a cage for herself and locked herself inside. Ed Gein was trapped in it too, but Henry didn't want that. He craved freedom and wanted to leave. He said he would abandon Ed Gein. However, with his love for his mother reaching an extreme level, Ed Gein wouldn't allow anyone to speak ill of her. Then, Henry continued to advise Ed Gein to leave and become a normal person. At that moment, a wicked thought suddenly flashed through Ed Gein's mind. He pretended that their mother was coming. Henry, completely unsuspecting, turned around to look. Suddenly, Ed Gein grabbed a piece of wood and attacked Henry. He even boasted that he had aimed perfectly. However, Ed Gein naively thought it was just a joke. It wasn't until fresh blood gushed from the back of Henry's neck that Ed Gein belatedly realized he had caused a major disaster. Ed Gein quickly pushed the wheelbarrow and ran outside. When Ed Gein turned back, he saw Henry suddenly stand up from the ground. Henry laughed and said that the blow was perfect. Then he closed the door. Clearly, it was all just Ed Gein's illusion to escape reality. That evening, at the dinner table, Ed Gein asked his mother if she had seen Henry, as Henry had something to tell her. Augusta replied that she hadn't seen Henry for a week. Then, she inadvertently uttered a harsh remark. If Henry had gone off with a dissolute girl like Ginny, then he was no longer her son. She helplessly recounted the story of her useless drunken husband, the one who had left her with two sons whom she considered the best. First, Henry, who had tarnished her honor and dragged her to hell. Then, Ed Gein, a weakling in every way, born only to cause her pain. At this point, Ed Gein's eyes were completely filled with tears. He vowed that he would not be like them. The next morning, Ed Gein went to the woodshed again and found Henry's body lying on the ground. Only then did he truly understand that what had happened the day before was not a dream. Ed Gein dragged Henry's body into the bushes. Then, he poured gasoline on the body and set it on fire, creating a false scene to make it appear his brother had died of smoke inhalation while clearing bushes. Despite his limited intelligence, Ed Gein's composure after committing the crime and his innocent acting skills began to show. Seeing his mother's heart-wrenching grief, a fire of jealousy ignited within him. Perhaps due to overwhelming sorrow, Augusta subsequently suffered a stroke. After intensive treatment, she recovered somewhat. One day, Augusta asked Ed Gein to go to the Smith farm to demand the outstanding rent. Considering his mother's weak health, Ed Gein immediately stopped her, saying he would go himself. But ultimately, he relented and took her along. However, upon arriving, they were met with a chaotic scene. Ginny was arguing with her ex-boyfriend because he didn't accept her puppy, claiming it was too expensive. Meanwhile, Augusta spoke up, saying the Smiths still owed her family $10. If she didn't have cash, she was willing to accept hay instead. However, in a fit of rage, he blurted out vulgarities and declared he wouldn't pay. Overwhelmed with anger, Augusta suddenly collapsed and never woke up again. At the funeral, Ed Gein wept uncontrollably. He bowed his head by his mother's grave for a long time, unwilling to leave. When he returned home, he walked with heavy steps. The atmosphere in the room was now one of emptiness and coldness. Ed Gein silently gazed at the rocking chair reserved for his mother, then slowly sat down. As fragments of memories flooded his mind, he suddenly heard a very clear voice telling him to leave the chair immediately. This startled him with fear. He stood up and looked around, but everything remained silent. As time passed, perhaps Ed Gein had gradually become accustomed accustomed to living alone. Finally, he could do what he liked without restraint. That afternoon, Ed Gein opened his mother's wardrobe again and took out a dress. Just then, a woman's angry voice rang out, ordering him to stop. He froze and realized it was his mother. It seemed she had always been there, silently watching over him. A moment later, she softly told him he could take her home. He awkwardly asked his mother how he could do that. That night, he drove to the cemetery, picked up a shovel, and began to dig, but he couldn't break open the coffin lid, and he couldn't reach his mother. Ed Gein burst into tears like a child. He then repeatedly apologized for not being able to be with her. But then the familiar voice told him to stop complaining and just continue digging the grave of the woman beside her. Although he didn't fully understand his mother's intentions, he immediately set to work. After a while of strenuous digging, he managed to lift the body. He quickly left and threw the woman's corpse into his car. Back home, he washed his hands. He looked at the corpse on the rocking chair, and a sick smile spread across his face. He bent down and gently removed her shoes and silk stockings. Although the body had only been buried recently, after several days it had begun to decompose and swell. He didn't intend to do anything filthy, but rather to skin the woman. He did this to imitate character in that comic book who was making a lantern out of human skin. Ed Gein was unaware that, despite his intellectual disability, he was suffering from severe schizophrenia. His bloodthirsty heart was gradually becoming uncontrollable. This man particularly liked wearing his mother's clothes and constantly wore a piece of human skin on his face. Ed Gein's tableware consisted of bowls made from human skulls. He frequently went to the cemetery at night to dig up graves. Yet such a man had a beautiful girlfriend. That evening, Ed Gein was having dinner with his mother. In his perception, his mother seemed still alive, but in reality, it was all an illusion. It could be said that he was scolded a lot by his mother, who constantly forbade him from bringing any promiscuous women into the house. But Ed Gein frankly admitted that he liked Adeline very much. He felt comfortable in her presence and asserted that even if his mother forbade it, it would be useless. The next morning, Ed Gein and Adeline went to a double ice skating rink together. They seemed very close. Adeline was a girl with a peculiar personality. She liked collecting photos of criminals and corpses. She even aspired to become a professional crime scene photographer. Although Ed Gein's intelligence couldn't fully grasp her thoughts, he was a good listener. He then mentioned that she had previously shown him a photo of a Nazi female officer with an ashtray made of a skull. Adeline seemed very interested, so he had spent the past 2 days making a similar one himself. They could go to his house to see it before dark. Although Adeline found the reason somewhat illogical, she agreed to go with Ed Gein because she already had feelings for him. Soon, Ed Gein drove home. He waved towards the figure in the window, but in Adeline's eyes, it was completely dark. She had no idea that Ed Gein's mother had passed away long ago. Inside, Ed Gein lit the oil lamp. The kitchen was a mess. Although Adeline complained a few times, she patiently helped him clean up. Seeing her diligent demeanor, he unexpectedly suggested that they start dating officially so he could introduce her to his mother. Ed Gein always insisted that Adeline was the only one who could understand him. Suddenly, Adeline noticed a bowl in the sink. Its shape resembled a human skull, but she didn't dare think that way. The next second, Ed Gein took her hand and led her upstairs. Approaching the bedroom door, a strong scent of perfume mingled with a foul odor. But what piqued Adeline's curiosity even more was the wall next to it, covered in some unknown material. Within it, there was a protruding area resembling an animal's nipple. Lost in the throes of romance, she paid no attention to the unusual details along the way. She enthusiastically greeted Ed Gein's mother, but the woman sat motionless in her rocking chair like a statue. Perhaps the old lady was hard of hearing. Adeline mustered her courage and approached, saying, "I just wanted to say hello." But she was met with silence. Ed Gein, visibly displeased, told his mother that her silence was impolite. Adeline thought his mother disliked her and was deliberately refusing to stand. Feeling hurt, she stormed out of the room and left the house. Their first date ended on a sour note. When Adeline left, Ed Gein went inside and loudly demanded to know why his mother had treated his girlfriend that way. But Augusta insisted she was a spoiled brat. Augusta declared she would never speak to people like that and that Ed Gein shouldn't even think about touching Adeline. Ed Gein was furious. He told his mother he wouldn't let her humiliate the woman he loved. Meanwhile, Adeline, who hadn't gone far, quietly stood behind a large tree, observing. Hearing the heated argument between Ed Gein and his mother inside, her heart softened. Moreover, he insisted to his mother that he loved her very much. Ed Gein, however, grew increasingly angry. He felt overwhelmed and tormented. He grabbed a hunting rifle and went to a bar to drown his sorrows in alcohol. Mary, the barmaid, who had always considered Ed Gein a gentle fool, didn't pay much attention to the rifle he carried. Knowing Ed Gein had just gone through a breakup, Mary said she knew some stylish girls from Chicago and could introduce him if he needed anything. However, this remark immediately struck a sensitive spot for Ed Gein, as his mother hated that kind of person. Taking Taking advantage of Mary's inattention, Ed Gein pointed his shotgun at her and pulled the trigger. He then calmly walked into the bar and dragged the woman's body home. The next morning, the police arrived at the scene. According to a nearby witness, Ed Gein's car was parked right outside the door when the gunshot rang out. However, the police didn't believe a man like him could commit such a horrific crime. They even thought he wouldn't dare kill a fly. After killing the woman, Ed Gein quietly went to Adeline's house. Through the keyhole, he saw his lover arguing fiercely with her mother. It was all because of him. Ed Gein silently placed a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked by the roadside in front of the door and turned to leave. As Adeline entered the bathroom, intending to wash away the stress of the past 2 days, a figure suddenly appeared behind the shower curtain. Ed Gein, in a blue floral dress, held a sharp knife. No one could understand why he would be so cruel to the woman he loved. At the same time, a classic scene from Hitchcock's first psychological horror film, Panic, released in 1960, was playing in the movie theater. Audiences at the time were still finding it difficult to accept such daring imagery. Meanwhile, Hitchcock, the originator of it all, walked out of the theater satisfied. He believed he would rewrite the history of horror films. Meanwhile, due to her past abuse from her drunken, useless husband, Augusta constantly reminded Ed Gein that he should never touch a woman. He shouldn't burden them with childbearing. She even carelessly remarked that she should have disposed of her son's precious possession so he couldn't procreate. Ed Gein grew up in such a distorted environment, developing a morbidly obsessive attachment to his mother. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. He quickly removed his mask and hid his mother's clothes under his coat. It turned out to be 2 police officers asking if he had been to a bar the previous night. Ed Gein calmly replied that he had spent the entire night with his mother. His car had broken down a day ago, so he hadn't been anywhere recently. After questioning him, the police believed Ed Gein was incapable of doing such a thing. They apologized for disturbing him. Before leaving, Ed Gein pretended not to know what had happened to Mary and questioned the police officer. The officer said Mary had been murdered and died a very tragic death. Ed Gein feigned sympathy and provided the police with a few clues. He suggested that her past in Chicago was not clean and that she had many grudges. It was very likely that shady characters were behind it. The next morning, while Ed Gein was eating at a familiar restaurant, Adeline unexpectedly appeared. It turned out she was passing by on business. Seeing his familiar pickup truck, she got in. Upon seeing Adeline, Ed Gein vaguely asked if she was still alive because he thought he would never see her again. At this point, one can imagine his inner turmoil, a jumble of truth and falsehood. Although Adeline didn't understand what her boyfriend was saying, she was still very happy. She even apologized for leaving his house that day because she was so scared. He said he had talked to his mother and promised to behave more appropriately next time. He explained that she hadn't been feeling well lately, which was why she had been so irritable. Their relationship quickly returned to normal. Then Adeline took out 2 photos she had cut from a newspaper. They clearly showed a man and a beautiful woman. She said they were actually the same person. For the first time, through her words, he learned about the existence of gender reassignment surgery. That story planted a seed in Ed Gein's heart. He excitedly said that he had a surprise for her on Friday. Then, he quickly left. As night fell, he went to the cemetery again. This time, he aimed for the grave of a wealthy person. After carefully observing, he pried open the coffin lid. The corpse inside had turned into a skeleton. He broke the skeleton's arm and removed a huge diamond ring from its finger. The following evening, Ed Gein invited his girlfriend to a fancy restaurant. It was their first time drinking alcohol. In his drunken state, Ed Gein drove to the cemetery. Adeline thought he wanted to take her for a thrilling, unusual experience. But suddenly, he asked if she wanted to marry him. Adeline was astonished, but she only hesitated for a moment before happily accepting the proposal. The only problem was that the wedding ring seemed a bit too big. He inadvertently said that the woman's hand was much fatter than hers. Adeline looked skeptical about her boyfriend's remark, but he quickly figured out that the ring seller's hand was too big. The next morning, Adeline took him to Mrs. Heller's house. It turned out she had always worked as a nanny there. Worried that Ed Gein would be idle all day, she had voluntarily quit her job and introduced him to her employer. However, Ed Gein's gaze kept lingering on the woman's chest, making her feel uneasy. But because there was another nanny in the house named Evelyn, who was hospitalized with paralysis, she currently had no better option. Ed Gein's job was to take care of the children. Yet, in the middle of the night, he brought the 2 children back to his house just to perform a clumsy magic trick to prove that he was more qualified to be a nanny than Evelyn. He placed a finger bone inside a skull and began to repeatedly move it around. Then he asked the 2 children where the bone was. They guessed correctly and thought the trick was too simple. But surprisingly, the finger bones suddenly transformed into a whole finger. Even so, the 2 children still felt it wasn't dramatic enough, so Ed Gein came up with the idea of disguising himself as a girl. He went into the room and put a skull on his head. Finally, this final boss managed to scare the 2 stubborn children. Afterwards, Ed Gein took the 2 children home. The landlady almost called police. Of course, Ed Gein lost his job. The following night, Evelyn, though not fully recovered, had to return to the mansion to work. But while she was taking care of the children, strange noises suddenly came from outside the window. They said they saw Ed Gein standing below. However, when Evelyn, curious, went closer, she saw no one. She even thought the children had mistaken him for someone else. Until, in the quiet of the night, the strange sounds came again from downstairs. Evelyn mustered up her courage and followed the sounds down to the basement, but the sounds suddenly stopped. Just as she was still looking around in bewilderment, a man suddenly appeared. The next morning, Adeline packed her bags and was ready to move in with Ed Gein. He told her not to go upstairs because his mother was usually asleep at that hour. Then he picked up his hunting rifle and prepared to go into the woods to hunt 2 rabbits for dinner, while Adeline, with a completely happy face, was unaware that Ed Gein had locked Evelyn in the shed. It turned out that, according to Ed Gein's logic, he lost his job because of Evelyn's existence. If this only competitor disappeared, the boss would choose him again. Ed Gein stepped into the darkness and picked up something rotten. Evelyn looked closely and was terrified. What Ed Gein was holding was the heavily decomposed body of his mother. Ed Gein kissed his mother's forehead and placed an iron basin in front of Evelyn to prevent blood from splattering. Then he took a hammer and placed it in his mother's hand. Before long, Evelyn had become a cold corpse. He smeared grease all over her body and carefully wrapped her in several pieces of cloth like a mummy. Clearly, Ed Gein was starting a new work of art. At the same time, Adeline went upstairs because she felt it would be impolite not to greet her future mother-in-law. But the very next second, as she turned the rocking chair around, a horrifying sight unfolded before her eyes. At first, she hesitated a little, but to satisfy her boyfriend's little whim, she gave him her lingerie. With such an understanding girlfriend, Ed Gein naturally fell deeply in love with her. Adeline also spoke seriously about Augusta. She discovered that Ed Gein's mother had actually been a corpse for a long time. Yet Adeline chose to forgive him. She even tacitly accepted her lover's bizarre preference, seemingly with a touch of excitement. Afterwards, she even scolded him, calling him a pervert. She asked how he felt first time he touched a dead body. He said it was a very new experience. Hearing this, she showed no fear. On the contrary, she felt incredibly fascinated by what belonged to humanity. It's unclear how 2 people like them could find each other in such a strange way. The next morning, Ed Gein went to Bernice's shop, intending to buy some materials to renovate his house. Seeing her looking sad, he offered some words of comfort. This deeply moved her, and she even agreed to give him a discount because he didn't have enough money. He was curious about what she had been through, so he invited her to dinner. However, his eyes kept lingering on her chest. At the dinner table, Bernice finally revealed the truth. It turned out that after several years of marriage, she couldn't bear the loneliness and had an affair with a married man. His wife, unable to bear the gossip, had chosen to do something reckless. This immediately made them the target of everyone's criticism. She had thought the man would elope with her, but instead, he played the disappearing act. When she realized Ed Gein's gaze was almost glued to her chest, Bernice's earlier sorrowful demeanor completely changed. She adopted a strangely flirtatious attitude. Then the familiar scene repeated itself. Before the meal was even over, Ed Gein took her to the ice rink. The 2 of them looked completely out of place in their surroundings. Ed Gein went to the store intending to buy 2 bottles of water, but the saleswoman generously waived price. She even jokingly suggested she would make a wonderful sofa. That night, Ed Gein went to Bernice's house. Under the influence of alcohol, he gradually revealed his true nature. However, instead of finding him perverted, she encouraged him to follow his instincts. They quickly became intimate. Bernice was going through a second youth. She said she hoped Ed Gein would move in with her the next day. If he was worried about gossip, she could even move to another city. But Ed Gein still had a girl waiting for him at home. When Bernice learned of this, she forced him to choose between the 2. Her firm attitude made Ed Gein see the image of his mother in her. With his morbidly obsessive attachment to his mother, Ed Gein chose Bernice without hesitation. Upon returning home, Ed Gein told his mother his decision. He would be leaving the house the next day, but his mother told him to just leave her, like Henry had done. Ed Gein quickly reassured his mother and promised to visit her often. However, that didn't seem to be what Augusta really needed. She insisted that the other woman would betray Ed Gein, just like any other woman. They would all abandon him, just as he was abandoning his mother. Seeing his mother's sorrowful face, he decided not to leave. But his mother was still not satisfied. She continued to hurl harsh words, saying that the other woman was just a shared bicycle that anyone could ride. Moreover, she had caused an innocent soul to die and never find peace in hell. Bernice was a demon seducing Ed Gein, gradually leading him down into the abyss, and then that woman would deceive him. Moreover, she had relationships with many people, so she could easily contract the disease. Ed Gein once again burst into tears. He denied that he had been infected, but all of this did not escape his mother's notice. She said that she smelled it on on him and felt utterly disgusted. The hallucinations from his mother's words caused him immense pain. He silently left the room. The next morning, before dawn, he carried his hunting rifle to Bernice's shop. She greeted him and quickly locked the door. In the back shed, she not only prepared a candlelit dinner, but also carefully selected a set of underwear for him. But then he unexpectedly said that their relationship was over. Bernice was extremely surprised. She didn't understand what was happening, so Ed Gein said that he had spoken to his esteemed mother. His mother believed Bernice had contracted the disease. However, Bernice vehemently denied it, insisting it was all malicious fabrication. No matter how much the landlady explained, he only believed what his mother had instilled in him. In a fit of anger, Bernice chased Ed Gein out, but his hand instinctively reached for the underwear on the table. Noticing this, she shooed him away and yelled at him to return it. At that moment, he noticed the brand new hunting rifle hanging on the wall. He suddenly said he wanted to go deer hunting. Bernice angrily took the rifle down and placed it on the counter. She declared their relationship over. Then she quietly walked to the window. But she didn't notice Ed Gein behind her loading the rifle. While Bernice was reminiscing about her past, Ed Gein asked her how much the rifle was worth. She said it was $19. Then she told him to get out. She didn't want to see his face again. Ed Gein granted the woman's wish with a gunshot. Then, once again, he calmly dragged her body back home. Sometime later, as winter approached and everything was covered in a blanket of white snow, two lost tourists happened to pass by Ed Gein's house. They opened the shed, intending to warm themselves up before leaving, but suddenly, a cold voice rang in their ears. Ed Gein didn't want them inside. The man hastily apologized. They said they had been hunting deer and gotten lost, asking for directions back to town. Then, they inadvertently saw something they shouldn't have seen. Terrified, they immediately fled. The next second, Ed Gein, wielding a chainsaw, chased after them and killed both of them in the snow. After everything was done, Ed Gein took Adeline home and told her he had prepared a big surprise for her. The two entered the dark shed. When Ed Gein struck the match, the sight before Adeline astonished her so much that she was speechless. Yet, unafraid, she walked straight ahead to where a corpse hung upside down, its internal organs ripped out. Adeline picked up her camera, ready to take her first steps on the path to becoming a crime scene photographer. She asked her boyfriend what she should do next. He remained silent, then responded with a mysterious smile. Meanwhile, Adeline had been taking many crime scene photos. She felt it was time to go to New York to make a living. Despite her mother's warnings, she defied her mother's ambitions. Her mother was deeply hurt and insisted on leaving town. The next morning, Adeline arranged to meet Ed Gein at a restaurant and told him she was going to New York to follow a photographer she had admired for years. If everything went well, she would bring him over once she was settled. But Ed Gein didn't even know which way New York was. On the way home, he had only one thought in his head: his mother's advice that once he had found a wife, he should quickly have children with her. Seeing Ed Gein's impatience, Adeline suggested that while she was away, he find another woman to satisfy his needs. But he replied that he wasn't interested in the women of this town. Soon after, they went to the cemetery, where a middle-aged woman had been buried a few days earlier. Adeline's plan was to have the woman in the coffin temporarily replace her. The next morning, Adeline hastily said goodbye to her friends and set off for the New York she had always dreamed of. But this place was completely different from her imagined image of a big city. The exorbitant hotel prices forced her to choose a room without heating. While Adeline was freezing, Ed Gein seemed much more comfortable. He brought the corpse home, put on romantic music, and even played a song himself when he was in the mood. After spending the night together, Ed Gein discovered that he seemed more suited to dead bodies than to living people. Meanwhile, Adeline finally met her idol. Because of the trouble, the other person had agreed to meet her once. Adeline said that she greatly admired the art of corpses. She said that no matter how gruesome the crime scene was, she could find joy in it as long as they gave her a chance to practice. Then she pulled out a stack of photos from her bag. But the man only glanced at her briefly before asking where she was from. When Adeline said she was from Wisconsin, his attitude changed completely. He even sarcastically remarked that her town was nothing but garbage. He claimed her photos were worthless in the eyes of a real photographer. Adeline was deeply humiliated, her dreams shattered. She cried in the cold hotel room, but when she wiped away her tears, they had frozen solid. Unable to bear it any longer, she went to the reception desk and demanded a refund. Of course, Adeline suffered another humiliating ordeal. After a fierce struggle, she snatched the owner's wallet and rushed out into the heavy snow. The following evening, she trudged home. She had hoped to receive some comfort for what she had experienced over the past 2 days. Instead, her mother coldly stated that her lack of talent was simply due to a mental problem. Adeline's mother even recounted that when she became pregnant unexpectedly, she didn't want to keep child, so she deliberately fell down the stairs again and again, but still didn't miscarry. Perhaps those impacts damaged Adeline's brain, causing her to do things that embarrassed her mother. Her mother scolded her, saying she wasn't normal. With a cold heart, Adeline went to Ed Gein's house, believing that perhaps only the man before her could understand her. They quickly began to explore the origins of life. But suddenly, Ed Gein stopped. While she was still bewildered, he said he had something to say. He clearly showed his displeasure at her body being too warm. Then, he told her to sit in the bathtub. She let him pour a bucket of ice cubes over her. Meanwhile, after hearing about Ed Gein's shady activities, a police chief and a subordinate went to his house to investigate. This was undoubtedly a scene that would haunt them for life. Pushing open Ed Gein's door, they found the room teeming with moths. A strong, putrid smell of decomposition filled the air. On the table sat a lamppost made of a strange material, but they didn't realize it was human skin. As they went further inside, the stench from the kitchen grew stronger. The police chief was surprised to find a mask on the cupboard that looked incredibly realistic. Something was cooking on the stove. He used a fork to pick it up and realized it appeared to be the internal organs of some kind of animal. Next, he lifted a blood-stained linen cloth nearby. A section of blood-soaked intestine was revealed. Even a fool would understand that something horrific had happened there. The police officer immediately called for reinforcements. Soon, a large number of police officers arrived and ransacked the house. Inside, they discovered more than a dozen heavily decomposed bodies along with many dismembered limbs. It seemed Ed Gein had used them as decorations. Days had passed without Frank seeing his mother, causing him great anxiety. It turned out he was Bernice's son and also a police officer. The next morning, Frank went to his mother's shop and found the safe missing. A blood stain remained on the wall. Sensing something was wrong, he searched everywhere. Then he discovered a carefully wrapped set of lingerie in a gift box in the warehouse, along with a note addressed to Ed Gein. This made Frank suddenly realize something. He frantically rushed deep into the warehouse, just as a car unexpectedly pulled up. Ed Gein had no idea what was happening and walked right into a trap. Seeing a large number of police officers gathered outside his house, he bewilderedly asked what they were doing there. He even told them they shouldn't be entering his shed. The next second, he was apprehended. At that moment, a heart-wrenching scream erupted from inside the shed. Frank realized the body hanging upside down from the rafters was his mother. Meanwhile, Ed Gein outside feigned innocence, claiming someone was trying to frame him. The next moment, Frank, enraged, lunged at Ed Gein and beat him until his face was covered in blood. Several police officers had to intervene to separate them. However, Ed Gein remained utterly confused, even trying to justify his actions by saying that he and his mother had always gotten along very well. Soon after, Ed Gein was thrown into prison. Forensic experts used all the collected organs, but were still unable to reconstruct a complete body of Frank's mother. Therefore, they could only conclude that the missing part were most likely in Ed Gein's stomach, and Adeline, who had a close relationship with him, was naturally implicated. This case, which shocked the nation, quickly attracted media attention. But Adeline, beautifully made up, could be considered one of the first to exploit notoriety to boost her own fame. She quickly distanced herself from Ed Gein, declaring her willingness to share stories about her personal life, artistic ambitions, and photography skills. She even publicly stated that she was always ready to assist any photographer needing help. Meanwhile, when questioned by the police chief, Ed Gein seemed to have lost his memory, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. Although he had a penchant for grave robbing, Ed Gein had absolutely no memory of harming anyone. The police chief was extremely frustrated because they couldn't find the murder weapon. It turned out Ed Gein had hidden the hunting rifle for a long time. Without direct evidence, they couldn't convict him. Although grave robbing was immoral, at that time the law didn't explicitly prohibit it. Fortunately, the results from the lie detector could still be considered a form of evidence. After some adjustments, the formal interrogation began. The police asked Ed Gein if he had committed the murder. He vaguely replied that he didn't remember anything. At this point, the lie detector needle didn't fluctuate at all. Ed Gein was frighteningly calm. It wasn't until the police chief asked about the cause of Henry's death that Ed Gein's expression changed slightly. But the machine still couldn't prove that Ed Gein was lying. Ultimately, due to the lack of conclusive evidence, Ed Gein was only admitted to a psychiatric hospital. After attending his mother's funeral, Frank walked out of the church in a dazed state. Seeing Frank in such an unstable condition, the police chief feared he might do something reckless, so he invited Frank to his home for Thanksgiving. At the dinner table, the police chief's wife brought out an electric knife, the kind used for butchering turkeys. Watching the blade move up and down through the turkey's carcass, a strange feeling arose in Frank's mind. The next moment, what was on the table seemed no longer the turkey, but his mother's corpse. The police chief transformed into Ed Gein's likeness, giving him a sinister smile. Frank was truly deeply haunted by his mother's death. After Ed Gein took 3 innocent lives and dug 18 graves, he was confined to a psychiatric hospital. But outside this man's house, there was a long line of people waiting to see it. The car Ed Gein had once stolen had even been auctioned off for an exorbitant price. All of that was now irrelevant to Ed Gein. Since entering the mental hospital, Ed Gein's spirits had improved considerably. He was even voted an exemplary patient every month. Only during his daily prayers did he reveal a hint of his deepest desires. He asked to continue his previous hobbies in this mental institution and hoped God would understand what he was saying. Just then, Nurse Santi knocked on his door. It turned out that the money from the auction, including all of Ed Gein's belongings, house and car, had been sent to him. Ed Gein gave Santi a tip and then pulled out a shopping magazine from under his bed. He asked her to buy 3 dresses and some women's lingerie. Although Santi was a little confused, she still helped Ed Gein buy the dresses for the money. Ed Gein needed the 3 dresses because he had mentally split into the personalities of a Nazi female officer and a transgender person named Leaner. The Nazi female officer represented violence and destruction. She was currently imprisoned, much like Ed Gein himself, confined to a mental hospital. Therefore, he couldn't remember ever harming anyone. Leaner, on the other hand, represented Ed Gein's desire for feminization. At this moment, he felt like 3 different pieces of a puzzle, none of which could fit into this world. That night, Ed Gein suddenly received shocking news. Nurse Santi, who had always treated him so well, had been transferred. In her place was a harsh and unreasonable nurse. This enraged Ed Gein, sparking his intention to turn the place into a full-fledged prison. A cold, murderous glint flashed in his eyes. When his intentions were exposed, he was immediately escorted back to his cell by 2 police officers. However, late at night, he suddenly opened the cell door and quietly went to the adjacent tool room, where 2 chainsaws were kept. Just as the nurse entered the bathroom and was about to sit down, a man's cough echoed in her ears. She looked down and, horrified, discovered that the person in the next cubicle was Ed Gein. She opened her mouth to scream, but her throat felt constricted. She couldn't utter a sound. She then frantically tried to crawl into the bathtub, but her attempt was like burying her head in the sand. Ed Gein easily pulled her out and used the chainsaw to pierce her body. After finishing, he returned to his room, satisfied. But the next morning, when Ed Gein pushed open the door and stepped out of his room, the sight before him stunned him. He believed he had killed the nurse, yet she was still there. He even heard her say good morning to him. He involuntarily collapsed to the floor. At that moment, he was completely unable to distinguish between reality and illusion. Later, the psychiatrist took him into his office and asked if he had made any friends recently. He replied that he had sent away 2 radios and talked to them late into the night every night. But the doctor bluntly shattered his illusion, asserting that the radios were still in storage. Furthermore, his room didn't even have an electrical outlet. All this time, he had been talking to himself. Finally, the doctor diagnosed Ed Gein with schizophrenia. Ed Gein finally understood where the voices in his head came from and why, from being a timid child, he had become a cruel killer who harmed many people. So, Ed Gein began to accept treatment with medication. His inner self gradually returned to peace. But Ed Gein's story wasn't over. 30 years passed. Since Ed Gein's story spread through the media, he had become an idol for serial killers. Countless letters were sent to the psychiatric hospital every day. These letters sustained Ed Gein's spirit, keeping him alive until now. That afternoon, 3 police officers entered Ed Gein's room. It turned out that on the West Coast, a serial killer had emerged, targeting young women. After committing the murders, he would decapitate his victims and leave the rest of the bodies in the wilderness. Apparently, this killer also had a hobby of collecting trophies, just like Ed Gein. Seeing the victims' photos, Ed Gein's lust seemed to resurface. But he managed to restrain himself and pointed out the crucial point. Removing the victims' heads was not easy. The bones were difficult to separate from the neck. He said he had tried all kinds of saws. Electric saws were too cumbersome. Wood saws were prone to jamming. Ed Gein then asserted that the best tool he had found was a high-speed steel-bladed hacksaw. He added that if the killer were an idiot, they would eventually choose that kind of hacksaw. The police only needed to investigate shops near the crime scene. Sure enough, not long after, Ed Gein saw on TV that the police had solved the murder case. A serene smile appeared on his face. After a series of crimes, Ed Gein thought he had finally made some amends to the world. Not long after, Ed Gein received news from the hospital director that he had lung cancer. However, after half his life languishing in a mental hospital, he had soon become indifferent to life and death. Finally, on a quiet afternoon, in his dying moments, Ed Gein saw a hallucination of his mother. She finally acknowledged his life's achievements. They sat together on the porch, enjoying a peaceful afternoon. And in real life, Ed Gein breathed his last, closing his legendary life. The film ends here. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next exciting films.